My experience with the Sperling Center really, in a sense, began in April of 2014. And at that time, my physician's office called me and said that one of the elements of my blood test, my PSA level, was outside of the normal range. And her office said, well, you've returned a result of 4.67. My physician was very careful to explain to me that that doesn't necessarily mean you have prostate cancer, that it's a marker only. But my prostate history was one that caused me some concern. It was something that ran on my father's side of the family. And so I didn't feel there was any way I could ignore it or set it aside and wait for another PSA test. I've spent the last 15 years of my career doing research for one of the state universities in Illinois. So I'm accustomed to doing research, and I decided to focus my research on myself and specifically PSA and what that reading might mean for me. I also learned that many researchers instead looked at PSA velocity. How quickly is that figure changing? So I went back and looked at my past records in that regard, and I found that only 1 year earlier I had been a 2.6. 2 years earlier I had been a 2.3. So in 2 years that level had doubled. I looked at several options. Some are guided biopsies, some are random biopsies. I even considered the possibility of what I learned is referred to as a saturation biopsy, in which a great many samples are taken at a great many locations within the prostate. I then started looking at some other alternatives, and I became aware of the possibility of an MRI analysis. And that led me really to the Sperling Center site. And then I focused my research efforts on MRI and what MRI could do for me in terms of analyzing whether or not I had prostate cancer and guiding a biopsy procedure. And in doing that, I found a higher level of comfort with Dr. Sperling and his techniques than I could with others. That process indicated that, in fact, I did have prostate cancer. The test came back positive. But the area that had been identified in the MRI process was confined. It was a relatively small area, and I had every reason to believe that it was probably early in the process simply because of my prior PSA readings. And I had already pretty much made the decision to go ahead with the ablation process, which is also offered at the Sperling Center. It seemed to me to be the most enlightened way to deal with the issue if I had to deal with it. And at this point I knew I did have to deal with it. The appointment was made that week, the same week that I received the results of the biopsy test. And so 2 days later, I was on the table having the ablation process performed. I can honestly say that the only part of it that was actually painful was the anesthesia, which is a local that's administered prior to the procedure. The process itself, there was some discomfort in the sense that you have to remain very still and you're laying on your stomach, but I didn't experience any pain. Afterwards, I felt a little groggy because of some drugs that had been administered to me to kind of just slow me down a bit. That's part of the process as well. Other than wanting to take about a 2-hour nap, I felt fine that evening, and my wife and I went out to dinner. And we could have left New York the next day. We had purposely scheduled that one extra day just in case I did have some kind of issues or I felt poorly. But I didn't. We could have left the following day, but we left the day after that and drove back to the Chicago area where we live. Since that time, I have not really experienced any kind of sexual or urinary after effects. It didn't take me very long to return to my usual activities. I exercise a great deal. I'm very much committed to it. I started hanging out in my garage and doing my work on my cars. All of those activities came back to me relatively quickly. I would say within 10 days or so, I was pretty much doing what I was doing before I left for New York. I would thoroughly recommend it to anyone, and I could do so without any reservation.